Good morning. I hope you had a good time yesterday with the cocktail reception and great first day Congress. Welcome back to the Congress. This is day 2. I hope you enjoyed the first day and the plenary sessions for sure. Great discussion. And I was able to visit all the parallel sessions, and it were very active presentations and discussion happening there as well. So I hope you enjoyed the reception last night and that you're now ready for this day 2. Day 2, of course, would be a bit different in terms of the format. We'll start today with the plenary session, but then we would go into the parallel session, and only after lunch we will come back for the 4th plenary. So this morning plenary is going to be on a very important topic, and we have a great lineup for you. So how would you, subsidies are something that we've been dealing with the WTO negotiation and everything. So we need to have good conversation about how to imagine good subsidies for small-scale fisheries. And for this, we have the chairs of the session who are part of the organizing committee members. Jose, Brian, and Pekka will be your host for today. Let's welcome them to the stage, and Pekka is actually joining online. So, Jose, Brian, the floor is yours.
Here we are. Well, we are, Brian, Pekka, and me, trying to introduce the session about imagine good subsidies. We, as you know, governance is a very relevant element to analyze how fisheries work. The perspective of governance analysis is so relevant to understand how things move in the reality, how the interactions between the different actors that are the different elements of the governance system try to solve societal problems and create societal opportunities. This dual dimension of solve societal problems and create social opportunities is so relevant. And in order to go forward in this process of solving societal problems and creating social opportunities, the analysis of the interactions is extremely relevant. The interaction between the three main actors of the governance system: the state, with all the multiple dimensions of the state, from the municipalities to the European Union. There is many ways to understand what these different elements of the state, of the international, digamos, the multinational institutions interact between them and with the market actors and the civil society. These interactions might have multiple dimensions, and one of these dimensions is subsidies, is taxes and subsidies, how the money flow, how the taxes contribute to the financing of the state and multinational actors. And these subsidies should be aimed should be understood as a financial aid supplied by a government or an element of the state to industry for reasons of public welfare. And we need to think about if fisheries subsidies until now have been really aimed of have finally helped to public welfare. I don't doubt that they have been intended for public welfare, but we can think about if they have achieved these results. Some elements that are usually present in the literature about this subject is that capacity enhancing subsidies have fueled the development of larger scale fisheries for a long time. And sometimes this capacity enhancing has gone against the sustainability of the fisheries, and for a long time, some of the common fisheries policy in the initial years have been contributing to this process. It's also usual to, in the literature to say that these subsidies frequently have made small-scale fisheries less competitive, as their share of subsidies is often limited, and in somehow that alternative subsidy models are needed to enhance low-impact fisheries and resource sustainability. This is a quotation. This is the front page of the book that we developed 2 years ago about the small-scale fisheries in Europe. And I want to highlight one quotation. This is from Paul Den Bol, who was a professor at Aalborg University. He was working at DG Mare. He was working in the Green Paper for the Common Fishery Policy Reform in 2009, and he was also working at ICES as one of the head of ICES. This quotation for me is very relevant. How subsidies might have helped to large or medium-scale fisheries to have a voice in all the process of the governance, in all the governance process related to fisheries, and how difficult has been for small-scale fisheries having a similar voice, having the similar capacity of influencing this governing process for a long time. So usually the representatives that participate in this governing process are mainly from the larger scale fisheries and not from the small scale. And to work on this, next slide, please. To elaborate on these issues, we have three presenters. Owen McAudit from the European Commission. He is the deputy head of the unit in charge of coordination of the common fisheries policy and structural support in DG Mare, the European Commission. Sebastián Villasante, who is a professor of economics at the University of Santiago de Compostela, has been working on subsidies for a long time. And Mikel Ortega, who is a coordinator of the areas of political ecology and marine environment at the N Foundation, that is now also working at CSIC, Research Center of the Spanish government. So, Brian, you want to say something else?
Good morning, everybody. Very happy to be here. I think Jose's introduction has covered all the moot points. So I think we get on with the presentations and then look forward to a good discussion. Of course, from LIFE's point of view, we have the slogan, public money for public good. And one thing we see in the subsidy, that the subsidies are certainly not achieving that aim of the public good. So I think if we can reflect on what it is we perceive the public good to be and what that means in fisheries, I think that would be a useful reflection. So thanks very much.
Yes, we have three presenters online, and then we will have some presenters some commentators in the room. Next slide, please. Sebastian Linkes, Bein Yentov, Jerry Percy, Katia Frangudes, Milena. They will try to elaborate on after the presentation with some comments, and of course the floor will be open for the participation of all of you. Thank you. We can begin with the first presentation from Owen. Thank you.
So, good morning. I'm going to talk about small-scale coastal fishing, and I'm going to put it in the context of the Common Fisheries Policy and of the EU fisheries funds over the last number of years. So, just to set the context, when we talk about small-scale coastal fisheries in the EU, we're talking about vessels that are less than 12 meters and that do not use towed fishing gear, and it also includes fishers on foot. This makes up a very sizable chunk of the EU fisheries sector in both number effort and also in terms of revenue. So approximately 80% of the EU fishing fleet is that small scale coastal fisheries, accounting for about 50% of the total EU effort. Extremely important, especially in the Mediterranean, where 50% of the fisheries of the small scale sector is concentrated, and they make up nearly 30% of the value in landings. So that's the context. Let's look a little bit at the role of small scale coastal fisheries in the EU. It's really a traditional role. It's something that has been around for centuries, and it is absolutely central to rural coastal towns and villages, a way of life for family, culture, tradition, songs, poetry, art, everything. It's really embodied in the community. And of course, it's a source of food for the community, especially for the local community and the local um, economic community. So it brings employment and also not only in the fishery sector, but also around the fishery sector. And the unique selling point of fish that comes from the small scale coastal fisheries is that it's local produce, it's quality, it's fresh, it's got a short supply chain. So that makes it very good, a good partner, let's say, with tourism, for example. And as small scale fisheries is such a big chunk of the EU fleet, the management of the small scale fleet and its contribution to good fisheries management are indispensable. It's really an integral part of good fisheries management. Small scale fishers are so close to the environment. They live and they breathe the sea. They're the first to notice, to react to changes in fish stock abundance, migration times, routes, where are the fish. They have a very close contact with the environment and its local characteristics. And so this really feeds into good fisheries management. And it's critical that we have good buy-in from small scale fishers to preserve the environment, to drive the transition of the EU fleet towards more sustainable fishing practices. That feedback that we need from the small scale fishers is not only their personal experience and feedback and how things are in the environment, but also in terms of data, monitoring data, scientific data. And this is reflected in the ongoing revision of the EU control regulation, where we're aiming to improve the availability and the reliability and completeness of fisheries data, also from the small scale fisheries. But of course, we know that requires changes in how fishers are going about their business. And this is what we have the fisheries funds for, the EMFF and the MFAF. It's there to support this transition. And I'll say a little bit more on that later. First, though, I just want to look at small scale fisheries in the context of the common fisheries policy. Small scale fisheries gets special mention twice in the objectives of the common fisheries policy. The first is that the common fisheries policy should contribute to a fair standard of living for those who depend on fishing activities, bearing in mind especially coastal fisheries and the socio-economic importance. That's in Article 2.5F. And then again, still in the objectives, that the common fisheries policy should promote coastal fishing activities, taking into account the social economic aspects. We move beyond the objectives then, and there are some other very notable special mentions for small scale coastal fisheries in the policy. One is that member states may grant preferential access to small scale fisheries in their coastal waters, in their 12-mile zone. And Article 17 then gives the power again to member states to decide on how fishing opportunities are allocated, stipulating that the criteria should be based on socioeconomic and environmental criteria, including the contribution to the local economy. So again, recognizing that local link that coastal fisheries have with the local market and supporting the local economy. Sorry, I'm missing the bottom of my slide. Okay. And then in terms of representation, there is special mention for the representation of coastal fishers in terms of producer organizations, that they're taken into consideration, and also for advisory councils. So a very important sector, or a very important segment of the sector, and important that their voice is heard. There are also fewer obligations on the coastal fisheries sector than there are for when it comes to larger vessels. So this includes, for example, fishing authorizations, landing declarations, sales notes, and separate stowage. They need to have separate stowage and more than that. So there are a lot of exemptions for the small scale fleet, because we recognize that the business operating model is different. So I think it's like this. Sorry, my screen doesn't really show. Okay, now you can see it. So I just want to talk about the funding aspect now. And I want to go back as far as the EFF, which was the Fisheries Fund from 2007 to 2014. Now, at that time, the reporting by the member states and by those who were supported by the fund, we got an awful lot less information than we do today. So there's not much detailed information that I can go into. So I just want to highlight two phrases that came from the evaluation at the closure of the fund. Sorry, it should be, yeah, evaluation at closure of the fund found that employment in small-scale coastal fisheries increased with EFF support, and it helped to maintain the fleet. And the second is that small-scale fisheries' ability to access funds can be constrained by access to private co-financing and or a lack of collective organization by the small-scale fishers. And I think those two things really have held true over the years. I will see, I'm sure it will come up in the comments today that those things have held true. EMFF, which ran from 2014 to 2020, support for small-scale coastal fisheries accounted for 47%. So nearly half of the support that was provided to vessels was for small-scale vessels. And small-scale coastal fisheries benefit from many other forms of support that are not directly targeted at the vessels. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a slide or two's time. And now we have we're just in the process of finalizing the member state programs for the MFAF, the New Fisheries Fund, which runs from 2020 until 27. And there's an even more increased emphasis on small scale. And I'm going to illustrate how things have changed over the years, looking now at the EMFF and then at the new fund, the MFAF. Now I want to show you a little infographic that I produced. This represents small-scale coastal fisheries support in the EMFF. And the data that I'm showing here is the situation at the end of 2021. The EMFF has a total budget of 6.4 billion. That's over the entire period. And by the end of 2021, member states had committed around 5 billion euro to various operations, all kinds of operations, accounted 5 billion. And we move into the smaller, the more kind of green, the second smallest blob. You'll see that EMFF spending on vessel-specific operations that accounted for about 30% of all EMFF spending. And then of that spending associated with vessels, 437 million is associated with small scale vessels. So that's about half of the spending on vessels is for small scale vessels. And just a word of caution on the data here. This is preliminary data. I've rounded it. It's based on submissions from member states, which happened over the summer, let's say, and it reflects the state of play at the end of 2021. And by the end of this year, every year at the end of the year, we publish a report on the implementation of the fund, and that will be available at the end of the year. So there you will have the complete picture. To illustrate that data. Okay, now I mentioned that support from the funds is not only about support that goes to the vessels. And here I think this is an important consideration when we think about what Jose was saying at the start of the session, and Brian also mentioned for the public good. If we look in much, much broader terms, these are types of support that are not linked to the vessels, but they bring that benefit to the small scale sector as well as to the public, to stakeholders in other segments of the fisheries, aquaculture, marketing, processing sectors, and also much, much wider. So for example, Natura 2000 protection, actions to reduce marine litter, implementation of the landing obligation, actions that help with climate change adaptation, investments in community-led local development, and more besides. These are actions that benefit really the public good. So we're talking about protecting the environment for everyone, and not even everyone, not even people. We're also talking about fish and birds, seabirds and plants, increasing biodiversity, reducing the litter at seas. So these are really valuable forms of support in terms of public good. And again, as with the previous slide, these are preliminary figures. So we'll have detailed figures out at the end of the year. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the MFAF. This is the new fisheries fund, which runs from 21 to 27. It has a total budget of 6.1 billion. Sorry, I know this is a typo or two in my slides, but 6.1 billion. The programs, we've been working for the last year or so with member states on the structure of their programs and finalizing them, and make sure that they pay attention to small scale coastal fisheries, for example. And I've illustrated in 3 bullets here. I've just chosen a number of elements of programming that we have reflected in the member states programs. The list here is not exhaustive, but I've just chosen a couple of things that are relevant, I think, to the Congress. So their programs should aim to support these things, and should take into account the needs of the sector, the local conditions. And so some of the things they would look at would be transition to sustainable and low carbon fishing, protection of marine biodiversity and ecosystems, socioeconomics and generational renewal, particularly in the coastal fisheries, improvement of skills and working conditions, and the economic and social vitality of the coastal communities around the fishery sector, collective organization, diversifying activities, and strengthening market organization. If you're interested to read more about the fund and all of the elements that are considered in programming and how the funding works, there's a more detailed description available on our website. The link is there at the bottom. So I mentioned that there's an increased emphasis on small scale fisheries in the MFAF fund by comparison to the EMFF. So just to highlight that, when programming, the member states must take into account certain things. They must take into account the specific needs of small scale coastal fisheries in their MFAF programs, and of course, describe the actions that are specific to that sector for the development of that sector. They should also endeavor to introduce simplified procedures for small scale fishers and small scale businesses which are applying for MFAF support. And also then for small scale coastal fisheries, projects are related to that can be supported with a rate of 100% public aid in most cases, 40% in some other cases, which are related to that 40% are related to vessel specific operations related to engines and change of volume and things like that. But the MFAF as a whole, it aims to support the CFP, and it's about developing innovative projects that ensure that aquatic and maritime resources are sustainably managed, fished, or exploited. And important to note also that the MFAF was developed in the context of the Green Deal with the biodiversity strategy, and at a time when there was an increased attention on climate change. So we're working with member state authorities at the moment to enshrine all those things and pay the relevant attention to all of them in their programs. we would hope to have the vast majority of programs adopted by the end of this year, and that finance will then become available within the member state from the start of next year. Okay, so just to bring things up to the current period, in 2020 we launched emergency EMFF support to operators that were affected by the pandemic. That has finished now, but just to say that we were there to support the sector when they couldn't go to sea, or when the markets dried up, when there wasn't the same demand for fish in restaurants and so on. This year then, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we launched some crisis support for operators. So within the previous fisheries fund, we've launched crisis support measures which allow member states to use any remaining funding that they have from the previous period to support operators that are affected by the increased costs of doing business. So it's the same for the MFAF. There's a crisis support mechanism under the MFAF. And both under the EMFF and the MFAF, operators can be compensated due to the significant disruption of the markets. And the kind of compensation that they can have is for income foregone, so income that they would otherwise have earned, or increased operating costs. So there's big changes, as we all know, in costs for energy, for raw materials. So this changes the business operating model, and that support allows the operators to absorb some of that and to continue operating as normal. There's also the possibility for producer organizations to activate storage aid, so that can help to achieve a better price on the market for their product. And as well as that, still linked to the invasion of Ukraine and the following crisis, there was the temporary crisis state aid framework which was activated, and that allows member states to support business undertakings in the fisheries and aquaculture sector with the support of up to €75,000, and that has been rolled out in several member states. Then, leaving the funding aside, there are two documents that we in the Commission are working on to have published as soon as possible. The first is the action plan to conserve fisheries resources and to protect marine ecosystems. And the second is a communication on the functioning of the common fisheries policy. So I'll just say a few words on them because they're important sort of contextualizing documents. The action plan was announced under the biodiversity strategy, and it will be adopted as soon as possible. There's still some work ongoing, but the idea behind it is to bridge environmental and fisheries policies, and so that we contribute strongly to the objectives of the biodiversity strategy and environmental legislation with the legislation that we have in place. So how do we contribute better to the obligations under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, under the Birds and Habitats Directives, as well as the fisheries legislation. And then the communication on the functioning of the common fisheries policy. This is something that will look at how each of the provisions of the common fisheries policy have been implemented over the last years. It's not an evaluation of the policy, and it's not intended to trigger a reform of the policy. It's just to look at the effectiveness of the CFP and a focus on how we can use the tools that we already have to have better implementation, let's say, and enforcement of what we have. That was it will be the culmination of a lot of consultation with stakeholders, public consultation online, consultation with the advisory councils, with regional and member state groups. We also had a big stakeholder event in June, 10th of June, I think it was. And now, my next slide, we're still have an open process where members of the public can submit their views on the functioning of the common fisheries policy. The link is here. Hopefully you'll have access to my slides and you can just click the link to follow it. That call for evidence is open until the 23rd of September. And please, we'd love if you would send your views. So with that, I would like to finish with a little video of, voila. I would like to finish with a little video of an example of how the EMFF has been used in Denmark to support small-scale coastal fisheries. There are also several other videos that we have available and written stories about how the EMFF has been used on various topics across all of the member states. So they're there in that second link. But if the colleagues could roll my video, that would be great. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Jeg hedder Niels Frederiksen, fisker skånsomt Øresund. Jeg har gjort det i 42 år. Går jeg primært efter sæsonens fisk, torsk, rødspætter, søtunger. Sætter en ære i at fiske skånsomt, bæredygtigt, har licens til at bruge mærket naturskånsomt.
Jeg arbejder med mærkningsordningen Naturskånsomt, som er en mærkningsordning, som vi lancerede sidste år i november 2020. Det vi også gør, det er, at vi selvfølgelig står for regelarbejdet i det. Og så igennem vores styrelse sikrer vi, at der bliver gennemført en kontrol af mærkningsordningen. Det er en statskontrolleret mærkningsordning.
Jeg hedder David Lange og projektleder, arbejder i FSK PO. Primært formål med det her projekt er at få det statskontrollerede mærke Naturskånsomt, at få det til at blive en succes. Og det bliver en succes, hvis vi får flest mulige kystfiskere ombord og får udbredt kendskabet til mærket i befolkningen og i blandt aftagerne. Det foregår sådan, at fiskeren, som skal være certificeret, skal tage et 2-dages kvalitetskursus, som sikrer, at han har den bedst mulige håndtering af fisken, og kvaliteten dermed højst. Han mærker fisken ombord Den mærkning følger så fisken enten til auktion eller til den pågældende opkøber. Så man kan sige, at det projekt, EOFF-projekt, vi sidder med nu, hvor mærket er lanceret, handler meget om at få arbejdet med de barrierer, der kan være blandt både hos fiskerne, stadigvæk med at komme i gang. Der er jo en række krav til fiskerne, kvalitetskrav, nye kontrolkrav osv. Vores forhåbning med mærket er jo, at det kan blive en styrke for det skånsomme kystnære fiskeri, som kan være med til på sigt at fremhæve, at vi har talt om en høj kvalitet med en lille miljøpåvirkning, og et fiskeri, som på mange måder, synes vi jo, er gearet til fremtiden. Forhåbentlig vil det her blive en succes på den måde, at man også vil se en prisdifferentiering, det vil sige, at de her kystnære mindre fiskere vil på sigt kunne få en højere pris for deres fisk, og dermed skulle fiske mindre, end de gør nu her, med en mindre miljøbelastning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Owen, for your interesting presentation. The next presenter is Sebastián Villasante from the University of Santiago de Compostela, professor of economics there. Sebastián, can you share your screen?
Thank you, Jose. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Jose, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I will start. Please let me know if you can see well the presentation. Okay, I will start. Otherwise, please let me know. Okay, thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for the kind presentation from the organizers, and congratulations again for the Congress. It's a real pleasure to stay here with all of you, trying to reflect a little bit more on how, as Ratana and also Jose said at the beginning of the session, how this very relevant issue needs to continue incentivize to reflect ourselves on how we could improve sustainable small-scale fisheries, not only here in Europe, but also globally.
Sebastian, I'm not sure whether we can see anything on the screen at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. Can you see it now?
That's better, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ratana. Okay. Well, in terms of harmful fisheries subsidies, the scientific evidence of this type of public support and use of public money has been extensively developed in the literature, and basically this type of harmful fisheries subsidies are those public financial transfers from governments or public entities that usually create a benefit that in the past usually incentivized overcapacity and led to overfishing. Basically, there are several studies and highlighting the impacts of harmful fisheries subsidies. By harmful fisheries subsidies, we mean basically those financial transfers that are used not to basically increase the capacity of fishing vessels over time. it usually artificially increase profits by reducing the cost of overfishing, or artificially increase the profits of fishing vessels, and also exacerbate inequality by undermining the social and economic ability of small-scale fisheries. But very recently, we also showed that at two levels, there were some papers that already show that reducing or removing these harmful fisheries subsidies will also help rebuilding fish biomass, leading to increased level of sustainable fisheries catch, but also income and well-being of fisheries. This has been developed by the Rocha and colleagues from ASTI as well as in 2009 and in 19, and also in the recent report from the Scientific, Technical and Economic Committee of Fisheries from the European Commission, in which we have been also highlighting the needs to reduce those fisheries subsidies who are socially and economically inefficient. In a couple of minutes, I will show why. So this is the scientific evidence we have right now on the table. In terms of the on the right, we can see the different regions of the world in which they have received this type of harmful fisheries subsidies. Europe is the third region in the world in which these subsidies has been allocated to the fisheries sector, and as we can see, and as already Brian and Jose said, I mentioned in the beginning, the small-scale fisheries receive quite substantial less financial support from the public entities compared to the large-scale fisheries. In the left, we can see also how the percentages of different subsidies in the European Union has been allocated since 1994 until 2018. And we see that in the beginning, those subsidies which are basically allocated to increase or to improve the capacity and enhancing the fishing capacity of fishing vessels has been predominant in the early stage of the common fisheries policy, and they have been progressively improving the trends of those fishing subsidies to those that are harmful to those who are more beneficial, right, in the past. However, this evolution has been, well, quite slow, but in any case, we want to highlight this good progress, or some progress at least, compared to the past. If we look at the different categories, not only both of small-scale and large-scale fisheries, in terms of allocation of fishery subsidies, well, the results from recent papers published by scholars has been quite informative, because only $6.6 billion in 2008 has been allocated to the small-scale fishery sector globally, while more than $28.8 billion has been allocated to the large industrial fisheries. This is not bad itself, but it shows clearly that the governments as a whole globally has been mainly or predominantly allocated or supporting large-scale fisheries compared to small-scale fisheries. The other thing is, however, we see that there are some very interesting and good news, in the sense that not only at the scientific community, but also very important international agencies like FAO, for example, has started to develop studies to highlight the importance of small-scale fisheries. For example, this is one of the key results of the recent report that FAO delivered and finished around the illuminating hidden harvests of the importance of small-scale fisheries. And when the FAO identified or tried to compare the importance of marine small-scale fisheries, only harvesting, compared to other ocean activities, we see that small-scale fisheries are ranked the most important activity in the world in 2008. This is a very informative, in my view, a very interesting result. And the other results now here more in Europe is that, as I said in the beginning, the European Commission committed to start to work intensively and progressively to try to at least generate, as Eon said in his presentation, to generate more evidence and monitoring data. And still, we need to do a lot of work still, but there are some interesting results. One of them is this one, is that this has been published in the report of the SINTEF report in 2021, and we use an extensive indicator, which is the total factor productivity, which measures the productivity of all production factor like capital, labor, and energy usually used, not only in small-scale fisheries, but also in large-scale fisheries. This total factor productivity has been extensively used in agriculture, but less in small-scale fisheries and large-scale fisheries. And we use this well-established indicator in agriculture to the fishery sector. And we found that, for example, the total factor productivity of the European Union fishing fleet show us that small-scale fisheries is more productive compared to large-scale fisheries, and also the efficiency and the productivity of small-scale fisheries is almost twofold, both in the North Atlantic Ocean and 16% higher in the Mediterranean Sea. This is a new result which highlights and should try to force us to reflect on the importance of small-scale fisheries, because usually scholars or international agencies or even governments usually suggest or assume that small-scale fisheries are not well organized, or even they are not productive or not efficient. So this is, for the first time, this is the first comprehensive analysis that the European Commission has developed so far. And the other thing is that size and productivity are not perfectly correlated in economic terms. This means that higher or larger fishing vessels are not necessarily more productive than small-scale fisheries. The other thing is that there has been an extensive discussion around the importance of to try to discipline harmful fisheries subsidies. And during the negotiations and during the scientific discussions, not only with scientists, but also with governments, more than 300 of scientists from almost 50 countries around the world has been collectively stated and informed that according to the scientific evidence that we have so far, harmful subsidies usually drive overfishing, biodiversity loss, and inequality, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere. And I would like to remark some of the key aspects of the new WTO agreement that has been recently adopted and approved in July 2022. The first one is that the rules apply to specific subsidies provided to marine wild catches. And so the agreement does not cover subsidies to aquaculture, to inland fishing, as well as to any onshore activity. This is the scope of the agreement. And this is the agreement in a nutshell. This is a very simple overview of the structure of the new rules. The first one is in Article 3 is a provision to subsidize fishing vessels and operators engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The second one, Article 4, relates to a provision to subsidize the fishing of stocks that in an overfished condition, meaning that the level of stock biomass is usually low. And the third rule includes a provision provision to the fishing on unregulated high sea, which in principle here in our Congress is not strictly related, but it depends because as we know, there are international fishing vessels that they are operating around the world, which usually have positive but also undesirable or negative interaction, a spatial interaction between large fishing vessels in third countries with small-scale fisheries or coastal fisheries in developing countries. This is, if we look at the draft agreement that was sent to Minister ahead of the Minister, there are a number of elements that did not make it into the final agreement. The most important element that was out is an additional and more general provision of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity, including a list of a specific type of subsidies. These lists include, among others, for example, subsidies related to fuel, subsidies to capital costs like vessels, or subsidies targeted at fishing beyond the subsidized member waters. But what is important to note here is that leaving this rule out of the agreement does not necessarily mean that all of these type of fishes are not regulated or disciplined at all, because they are regulated by the agreement rules to the extent that they fall within their scope. For example, if they are included or not within the illegal, unregulated, or overfish fish stocks. And also the agreement includes a flexibility mechanism, which means that no provision of fisheries subsidies will be taking place if measures are implemented to maintain fish stocks to a biological sustainable level. If we look at just very quickly, if we look at the first Article 3, is that prohibition, this determination is that can be made by this prohibition to subsidize engage in illegal or unregulated fishing, can be made by coastal state, by a flag state, or even by a regional fisheries management organization. So this is a pretty strict provision, but to trigger the subsidy provision, determinations must meet some simple criteria related to the evidence used and the procedure followed by this determination. This is to ensure that unfair determinations do not trigger the ultimate prohibition in Article 3. In Article 4, the WTO agreement tried to prohibit subsidies which applies to fishing activities for stocks that are recognized officially as overfish. Again, this can be done by coastal states or by any entities like a regional fisheries management organization, and this provision is again quite strict. However, there is an important flexibility. If the subsidies themselves of the other fisheries management measures are implemented to rebuild fish stocks to a healthy level, then subsidies are still allowed. And here, just two other elements to mention. The first one is that the assessment of stock status must be based on the best scientific evidence available to the coastal states that make it. And second, like for the illegal rule, there is a 2-year grace period for fishing activities by developing countries in their own waters. And finally, there are other type of subsidies that are regulated by the new WTO agreement, which is Article 5. And the first one is a provision to provide any subsidies on activities on unregulated high sea fisheries, or in other words, in situations where there is absolutely no conservation or management measures in place. These two following rules are not as strong as a provision because they both follow the same principle. They introduce an obligation to give special care and exercise to restrain when providing subsidies in two situations. The first one is when the subsidized vessels do not fly the subsidized member flag, or the second when the fish stocks are not assessed in their status, and their status is unknown, so we have no idea if they are healthy or depleted. This is particularly relevant in the case of small-scale fishery. Usually we face or we have to deal with a high number of stocks which are not assessed. And finally, a key element in the agreement related to the notification and transparency. This is a good news from the WTO agreement, which try to require to notify their subsidies every 2 years to member states, and they are obligated to provide information on stock status, fleets, and fishing vessels which are subsidized, along with wild catch data. So, in principle, we think that it is a good news that after 20 years we have a first agreement adopted by the WTO agreement. This is a good news. The not so good news is that looking closely to the current text of the WTO agreement is that there are some elements that will still need a huge effort of not only governments, but also between the different sectors, like small-scale fisheries and the large-scale fisheries sector as a whole, to try to collectively work together in a cooperative way to achieve sustainable small-scale fisheries. For example, the first of these key obstacles that we identify in the current text is that there are no explicit mention to small-scale fisheries as a key activity here in the WTO agreement. And this is particularly relevant in the context of, for example, Article 17 of the Common Fisheries Policy, which needs to take into account not only the stock status of small-scale fisheries, but also the quality of life as well as the socioeconomic conditions of people who depend on small-scale fisheries and who usually are localized in coastal communities. The other key issues is that there are some subsidized, like fisheries agreement, that are out of the current agreement. The other thing is that our interpretation is that states will be able to discipline harming fisheries subsidized only when fish stocks are already overfished. There is no any monitoring mechanism to try to avoid that particular and hopefully not desirable outcome. The WTO agreement also focuses explicitly on fish stocks. However, we think that there are still a lot of room to discuss, to have important conversation and agreements on not only on the impact of subsidized on ecosystem and ocean life, but also on the socioeconomic conditions and quality of life of people, especially from small-scale fisheries in developing countries, but also here in Europe. And also we identify two important issues. One of them is related to high sea, because they explicitly regulate the role of regional fisheries management organization, but the issue here is that these type of organizations are mainly managing usually quite well managed tuna fisheries, but there are other type of global large commercial fisheries, like for example squid fisheries in the Pacific, in South America, or in the Southwest Atlantic Ocean, that they are right now out of the current agreement. And last but not least, the WTO agreement introduced a 4 years ultimatum in which if 2/3 of the member states do not approve and deposit the instrument to accept the agreement within these 4 years until the agreement will enter in force, the text will be automatically not be in place. So according to other type of public goods and cooperation between players, like in climate change, in biodiversity, or even in other type of fisheries games, usually when cooperation and game theory are applied to a finite number of times, like this one, some players usually or typically play as conditional cooperators or free riders that typically or usually cooperate only in the earlier rounds of this type of agreements. And over time, however, the scientific evidence usually says that cooperation usually try to generally declines over time. And thanks a lot for your time. Thanks. I'm looking forward for a further conversation and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And the next presenter, Mikel Ortega, will develop an overview to some other issues related to the subsidies, some general issues. Mikel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, apologies for not being here. I see that there are many friends in the meeting room, so I'm really apologizing that I cannot be there. But in any case, I have been following the discussions of yesterday, and I think it is very clear for all of us that the discussion on subsidies is a key element for small-scale fisheries. So I hope we will have a nice discussion after our short presentations. I want to point out that even if I'm going to focus on subsidies, it's very important that we bear in mind that subsidies are just part of a broader scheme of public support to fisheries, including it's only just a part of the financial transfers that governments support the fisher sector. For example, there are other mechanisms such tax exemptions that can be even more important than subsidies as they are usually defined. So one thing that I'm not going to go for, but I think it's important and maybe we can discuss afterwards, is the need of coherence between subsidies and these other policies, both tax exemptions, but also regulations that include or do not include the internalization of environmental and social costs. And I think there's a clear problem here because subsidies discussion is going on one side and the other mechanisms are not following the same path. Sorry, Jose, I cannot hear you.
Please share your screen.
Sure. Here it comes. Can you follow it? Can you see it?
It works.
Okay, great. Then, well, so after this short presentation that I think it can be a topic of discussion afterwards, first of all, I want to thank the organization for organizing this hybrid event. I know it is very hard to organize these sorts of meetings, so thanks very much. And secondly, I want also to thank them because there has been a very clever change in perspective regarding subsidies. The usual way of analyzing the subsidies, as Sebastian has pointed out before, is that we analyze subsidies from the bad subsidies perspective that are based in the do not harm perspective. That is, let's try to avoid subsidies that create more problems than goods. But what the organization suggests us is that let's imagine good subsidies. And this is based in another perspective, which is the do good perspective. And I think that's a key difference and it requires a different approach to the work. So in this presentation, instead of going through a list of what I can consider to be good subsidy, what I'm trying to provide is an analytical scheme so it can help each of us to analyze by ourselves if a subsidy can be considered as a good subsidy or not. So the key idea here is that changing from the do not harm perspective to the do good perspective, it is not straightforward because the do good perspective is a little bit more restrictive and requires that subsidies are used only if at least 3 conditions take place simultaneously. First, subsidies are used to promote what can be considered as an agreed common smart objectives. Secondly, they do not damage the commons. And thirdly, they are used efficiently. And now, on the remaining part of the presentation, I'm going through these conditions to explain them a little bit more in detail. So let's go for the first one. The agreement of common objectives is a precondition to the definition of a good subsidies. And as you all know, that all those who have involved in the fishing communities, this is not straightforward at all. I mean, quite often we have different perspectives inside of the fishing community. So setting an agreement on an objective, it's difficult, and it requires that we have in place healthy democratic fisheries institutions. So without these democratic institutions, we cannot say that we're having good subsidies. We can have subsidies or do not have subsidies, but not good subsidies, because there's a requirement of taking some decisions on the prioritization of objectives. So I think that those that have to suggest which kind of objectives should be set in place and supported by public subsidies are small-scale fishermen. But I also want to point out here that there should be an agreement with other actors. And the reason is because this is public money. So of course, public administration should agree with that. But also in some contexts, other social actors that are relevant in the area where we are playing, they also should be supporting the proposal of small-scale fisheries. And the point why I focus a lot of attention on the idea of priorities and objectives is because what we can see if we go to many ports, harbors all around Europe, is that without prioritization, what we can find is a scattering of micro-subsidies that either do not have a clear objective, or the objective, they try to point it out to many objectives, but at the end of the day, they do not make the difference. And I don't think this micro-subsidies scattering could be considered good subsidies. But on the other way around, I think it's very relevant that if we set time and efforts to define proper objectives, it's important that they should be compensated. So I very much in support of increasing the volume of local participatory budgets. These sorts of schemes are every time more and more in place in many different other contexts and of fisheries, but I think they are relevant and they can be useful to support also the integration of the fisheries community in the common decision, which is a key element in the future of small-scale fisheries. Of course, these objectives have to be well-defined, and by well-defined, I mean that they should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. There's no a single space where this discussion can take place. There are very different spaces. It depends on the context. I mean, we can have co-management schemes, and yesterday we talked quite a lot about this issue, fisheries local action groups or producer organizations. But the point here is that in any case, what we have to set in these spaces are high-quality, democratic, and well-managed structures. And finally, I want to point out on this first condition that it is not enough to have subsidies well-defined because the objectives are well-defined at a small scale areas. No, it is not enough. I think there are many different decisions that are taken in a broader scale, either at the regional, at the national, or international level, that are relevant for small-scale fishermen. Let's think, for example, I remember yesterday it was mentioned the Article 17 of the Common Fisheries Policy, where the quota allocation should depend, in theory, and today it has also been mentioned, should depend on environmental and social facts. But, for example, this article has not been deployed almost anything. So we need good action of a small-scale fisherman where these decisions are taken. So I think it makes sense that there are some good subsidies candidates to support the organization of campaigns or organizations that work at this governance level. So let's go for the second condition. I mean, good subsidies should not damage the commons. I mean, no subsidies can be considered as good subsidies if they damage them. And issues as climate change, biodiversity crisis, the privatization of the sea, increasing volumes of pressures on the sea, it is something that is creating, let's say, fear, as it was said yesterday, or it is clearly a problem for small-scale fishermen, but small-scale fishermen can also be part of the solution. So I think there's a role for small-scale fishermen, for example, to set environmental recovery objectives on the ecosystem where they rely on, and public support should be set also for these sorts of objectives. And there's an issue here in terms of coherence between subsidies and the fishing practices, which is important. If we have subsidies on one side, and we have management plans that are not dialoguing, if they are not linked, we can have severe problems. We know from the past where we had subsidies, for example, to increase the overcapacity, and we did not have the management plans in place. And this creates us a very big problem in the past. So we have to avoid it. And how we should do it? I think subsidies should be linked to existing management plans that, of course, are evidence-based and are decided in co-management schemes or in schemes where small-scale fishermen are, of course, present. Another idea that I think it's key to avoid the damaging of the commons is that very often small-scale fishermen do not have enough support to get a specific small-scale scientific advice, or they do not have enough information in terms of the relevance, as, for example, Sebastian has mentioned before, on the socioeconomic information. So I think these sort of supports can be part of the good subsidies if there's enough agreement between the fisheries collectives. And finally, I also think that sometimes, and I'm pretty sure that you all have experiences of that, there are problems on the control side. I mean, sometimes there are agreements that are not fulfilled, and that's a fact that we have to face them. So why do not use subsidies to better control, to ensure that there is no damage on the farmers? So I think there's also a space on the, let's say, the basket of potential good subsidies to be used for better control on the fisheries activity. And then I'm going to finish with a third condition. So it is clear that in the context of limited public resources, subsidies should not only be effective, but also should be efficient. And by efficient, of course, we have to reduce administrative burden, we have to adapt them to a small-scale fishermen needs and capacities, and we also have to establish a good control and management system of the subsidies themselves. But we also have to look and we have to recognize that there's a multiple way of looking to small-scale fishermen's activities. We can look at it from the social perspective, from the environmental perspective, from the cultural perspective, from the economic perspective, of course. And we have to recognize that inside of the sector, there are different impacts and different potentials. So we have to be able to set the difference between the grades of small-scale fishermen. But what I want to point out here, and I think that's my key message on this point, is that we have to, I think it will be here and a key element to ensure that we use properly subsidies. We have to look a little bit, to look to the big picture where the activity takes place. And by that, I mean two things. On one hand, subsidies are just a part of the several tools that public administration have in order to rule a fishery. So using a part of the subsidies to ensure that through a political proactive activity of a small-scale fishermen, all these other tools, not only subsidies, but all these other tools do not harm the small-scale fisheries interest, but support them to develop low-impact fisheries. This may constitute a good use of subsidies if it's as such agreed. But also, I think we have to look even further out of the fisheries box. For example, what general public policies can be useful to revitalize small-scale fisheries? Maybe it's a basic income for all, or perhaps it's an improvement of immigration rules, or maybe possibly education improvements. So, and what about participating in the economy, blue economy and marine planning strategies that are taking place? Small-scale fishermen's community should be able to participate proactively on all these discussions. So I think that there's a role here for public subsidies to support them, so their link with non-fishery society is higher, and the global policies can also have a view from the fisheries sector perspective. And finally, thinking a little bit even more on the long term, I want to point it out that my feeling, this is something that we can discuss afterwards if you want, the future of a small-scale fisherman will not be linked only to technical fisheries issues, but to a broader system change. A broader system change that increases the support to local production, but also to low-impact economic activities, not only fisheries, but in general. So in this sense, supporting this system change could be strategic for lower-scale fishermen. But how can this be done? I mean, there's a lot of things that we can be talking about this, but I would like to point out only two things. We need a change in culture, and move to a culture that is more based in well-being, in sufficiency and solidarity. But we also need new economic regimes with a more relevant role for a social economy. And in this sense, supporting both cultural changes and niches of new, more democratic organizations in fisheries, but also solidarity economic in fisheries, such some of the already existing community-supported fisheries schemes, could also be an efficient way of using subsidies. So just to sum up, good subsidies are contextual, but I think they require at least the fulfillment of three conditions. Subsidies are used to promote what can be considered as agreed from common smart objectives. They do not damage the commons, and they are use efficient. It's not easy, but let's work together to defend them. And I think we can push together to achieve revitalize the small scale fisheries in Europe. So thanks very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Mikkel. Thank you to the three presenters. I think they have shown us very complementary overviews of the scenario about subsidies with different perspectives, but very relevant, all of them. Now we can. You want to comment something about the presentation, Brian? And then we will open the floor to some of the commentators that we have previously agreed to contribute.
Thanks, Josie. Thanks all our presenters, Owen, Sebastian, and Miguel. I just want to reflect on a few points that came up. In Owen's presentation, he provided a lot of data, which was quite surprising. 40% of support in the 2014 to 2020 went to small-scale fisheries. And of the vessel subsidies, half of what was given to vessels went to small-scale fisheries. 30% of all EMF went to vessels, 15% of the envelope, 50% of the 30% went to small-scale fisheries. He also highlighted the issue of a need to bridge the links between environmental and fisheries policies, which is something which the 2014 Common Fisheries Policy intended to do, and 10 years later we're now seeing things happening through the action plan and the implementation report. A key issue of small-scale fisheries, a key assumption, is that it has a lower impact. And that means the fishing effort deployed is much lower. One fishing day of a small-scale fishing boat, which is fishing for a few hours at sea, catching a few kilograms of fish, using a few liters of diesel to catch that fish, is not the same as one fishing day of a trawler, which is spending probably a week or maybe several weeks at sea, motoring long distances, hauling heavy gear, using a huge amount of horsepower, using a huge amount of fishing capacity to catch that fish. This can hardly be compared to a fishing day of a small-scale boat. Yet, in your presentation, Owen, you highlighted that 50% of the total EU effort is from small-scale fisheries. I think you need to look at that statistic carefully and think whether that's true or not. From our point of view, in life, we can't accept such a statistic. The impact of the small-scale sector, the effort of the small-scale sector is not the same as the large-scale sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I think how numbers are built is a very relevant issue. How we build the numbers, how we build statistics is so relevant to understand reality, that when some numbers are built with some strategies that are counterintuitive and are not really close to the reality, then some issues, some controversies might appear, of course. Then we can ask some of the contributors that we have previously agreed to comment on the presentations. Perhaps we can ask Sven Jentov or Sebastian Link to begin with some of the comments. Any of you are close, both of you. You want to come? Or...
Can I do it from here?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I have enjoyed these three presentations. I think they were great. And I learned from them. This has been an issue for a while, the focus on the relative distribution of subsidies to fisheries, the fishing industry. There was an important paper in Marine Policy in 2017 that on a global basis showed that only 16% of the total subsidies to the fishing industry goes to small-scale fisheries. We may wonder why it is so. How come that the distribution is so uneven? What are there arguments for it, or are there arguments for redistribution of the subsidies towards small-scale fisheries? And I thought arguments, for instance, by Sebastian, for that thing to happen is needed, and they are valid. And I think he provided some great arguments for such a redistribution. We tend to think of these two sectors as separate, and whatever we do in small-scale fisheries, it has nothing to do with large-scale fisheries. We do not, and we are not willing to actually entertain that interaction that is going on between these two sectors. And this was, for instance, very clear in the technical consultations that led to the small-scale fisheries guidelines. First of all, the word subsidies is not mentioned at all, but there is a lot of language using different concepts, different words. So there is a lot about financial support, and there is no lack of ideas of what such support could be about. And many of the issues that Miguel Ortega mentioned are also covered in the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So if you wonder, how would a world look like where the 16 versus 84% ratio was turned around? How would that look? What can we even imagine such a situation? That would require a major redistribution of resources, which would require a kind of effort that we can hardly imagine, given how power is differentiated in this industry. The word redistribution it appears only once in the 100 articles in the small-scale fisheries guidelines. Only one. And I remember very well the discussion we had. There was strong opposition from country delegates to even have that word in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, until one from the Norwegian delegation stood up and said, when we talk about land reform, we always talk about redistribution. So why don't we talk about redistribution when we talk about fisheries reform? That, I think, sort of had an impact on the discussion that was there. So this is an issue that we should entertain. We shouldn't continue to argue or think or believe that these two sectors are separate, and what is happening that you can sort of treat them differently without recognizing the interaction between the two, where small-scale fisheries certainly comes out as the loser. So there are some issues here that are difficult, and there is a lot of effort to avoid them, to bring them to the table. But I think it is important for a conference like this to make sure that it doesn't stay like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. The divide between the small scale and large scale usually is thought as a radical divide, as in the definition of the European Union. But in reality, there is a continuum between the small scale and larger scale. And then at some point, institutions like the European Union make a conventional divide. But of course, the interaction between the fleets are there all the time. And we need to recognize how these interactions work at the sea, and work at the market, because they are both of them extremely relevant in any case. Thank you very much, Svein. Sebastian, could you continue?
There is a panelist that would like to respond as well.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, when you asked me to comment on the issue of subsidies, I thought hard what subsidies actually are. So for my understanding, and I have a problem maybe a little bit similar to what Svein mentioned with the term subsidies, the concept and the definition. I also found the presentations very interesting and certainly important to measure the harmful and versus beneficial subsidies. But it all reminds me that we talk about subsidies only as an outcome of a system that we take for granted. I would rather, I feel some resistance in me to talk about this as subsidies, and instead call all together politics or political decisions to frame what we call as support or help. All these terms are sort of loaded, also versus the positive images and principles that we see in the CFP that has been shown by, don't know if I pronounce your name right, Ian from DG Mare earlier. So what I wanted to say is that when I hear subsidies as sort of framed as a remedy to the negative effects of an existing neoliberal market economy-based governance model that we all often sort of easily take for granted, management takes it for granted, the CFP is maybe kind of a very econic example of this governance approach, trying to bring together economic and ecological objectives defined in the MSY objective as sort of the pyramid that Svein was showing yesterday with the relationship between nature or natural resource and the monetary profit of it. And then we have the structure funds. I actually don't know if you would call them subsidy, to take care of the externalities of the CFP, like the social aspects, the place, the territorial dimension, and the small-scale coastal fisheries aspects. And I think we are, or I would like to remind ourselves that we can think about different images, like the rose image that Svein showed yesterday, based on an approach of ethics and responsibility and care between humans and nature, like fostering human-nature relations instead of this one-dimensional nature profit, and then we take care of the harmful effects of that approach. Yeah, so I'm just a bit puzzled here. I don't have a sort of very concrete thing, but what I wanted to share are some thoughts about thinking about alternative approaches, which I see also mirrored, for example, in the iceberg image that has been coined from the Diverse Economies Research Network once, where the top of the iceberg is the wage labor based commodity markets, capitalist enterprise. But in order to enable that, we need much, much more. And if we frame that only as subsidies, I think that is a sort of a skewed image for me. hope I try to get my point across here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Very interesting reflections.
Jose, we do have responses on the panel as well. For example, you can see.
Okay. Owen, perhaps you want to comment to some of the issues?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll just come in quickly. I think as Sebastian just mentioned there, the word subsidies is a very loaded word. It comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of negative baggage. I think we've come a long way since we started using that word. What we're looking at with the EU funds is to incentivize moves towards more sustainable fisheries, a transition. We're not subsidizing something that is not functioning well. That's not the idea behind the EU support. The MFAF in relation to the second presenter where we spoke about WTO, the MFAF doesn't have harmful subsidies in that context. There are strict conditions on investments in the fleet so that we prevent investment in overfishing and overcapacity. It's about financing moves towards low impact, sustainable fishing and aquaculture and contributing to a better status for the environment. The second thing I wanted to come in was on the image of small scale. And we need to be careful that with the image of small scale, it doesn't necessarily mean that because small scale happens locally, that it's always a sustainable practice. What we should look at is sustainable fisheries in the overall term. And I also agree with previous speaker that there is a continuum between what is small scale and what is large scale, and there's interactions all the way along. But if you look at in terms of small scale vessels, in particular in the Baltic Sea and in the Mediterranean Sea, there are thousands of the vessels in operation there. And there are very depleted stocks in those basins. And also the gear that they deploy in some cases can have a very high aggregate impact on the sensitive species. So static nets, for example, in coastal waters, these have the highest impacts we've seen on protected and endangered and threatened species. So it's a matter of balance between what is sustainable. We can't just say one type of fishing like small scale is sustainable and large scale is not. It depends on the context. And the third, I just wanted to make a clarification on the statistics that I gave in relation to expenditure on the small scale fleet. These are figures for the end of 21. So actually that accounts for a period when we had just rolled out crisis support for impacts of the pandemic. So there's a skew in those figures possibly on the amount of support that was allocated to small scale fisheries because they couldn't, supply the local markets because those local markets weren't there. So maybe they were affected disproportionately. So to see the full balance there, we need to wait until we see the full story and context will be published at the end of the year. Just a word of caution. Thanks.
And thank you very much, Owen. Just one issue. You used in your presentation the concept of effort. Saying that small-scale fisheries developed more or less 50% of the fishing effort in all the European Union. That figure is, to my understanding, counterintuitive to what I know about the small-scale fisheries and large-scale fisheries. What are you meaning for effort? What is the meaning of effort in that figure? Because it's very difficult to compare even the static gyros that I fully agree that using in some circumstances might have an impact on endangered species with what a large trawler or a large pool sustainers might develop as an effort, as fishing effort.
I off the top of my head, I don't exactly know the source for this, but let's not maybe get caught up on that. The important picture that I wanted to give was how big the small scale sector is and how important it is. That's the important message behind the statistics I was trying to show. As for exactly where it comes from, we can discuss that another time. I'm not exactly sure. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's relevant because in some audience, some similar figures have been highlighted, and we don't agree with those numbers. To my understanding, it's not fair to speak about effort in those terms. So if you could look where these figures come from, it would be very interesting. We have a contribution from Cornelia.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations and the debate. I just have a very quick question that pertains to what, Jose, you were alluding to. How are the numbers constructed? And for fisheries management, catch is one of the key features in terms of determining future action. I see that the Commission is making proposals to release the criteria for how to report. And with additional things on the table, it may end up with underreporting about up to 50% of the real catches, given that not all member states have the level of accuracy in their own reporting that would be wished for. So that is an imminent threat. If those criteria are released instead of us working on being more accurate in the assessments, what is management then based upon? It will be high-flying dreams or, images, but not data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Owen, you want to comment on that? I can comment also.
Yeah, just to say on that, absolutely, data is what we need, and we're pushing always for better data through the funding and also through the control regulation, the revision. We want to have more data so that we know what's happening at sea. It's always pushed towards having more informed decisions, best scientific advice, and you can only have best scientific advice if you know what's happening. So we're always pushing towards more data. Thanks.
Jerry to
yes, Jerry, perhaps Jerry Percy, one of the contributors we have suggested to speak about. Could you comment?
Thank you. Yes, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired, not so small-scale fisherman, and now a representative of small-scale fishermen in the UK. It used to be Europe, but something happened a couple of years ago that forced us all back to the UK. I haven't got it in my notes, but I can get quite irritated by the fact, and I've never suggested that all big is bad or all small is beautiful, but to suggest that one of the problems we have as small-scale fishers right the way across Europe, and I include the UK, is that because of complete failures of management, regulation and restriction, mostly of large scale, the small-scale fishers are often forced into less than sustainable activities just to make ends meet because of the lack of fish. So I don't think we can shoulder all the blame for the current situation. In terms of the conversation, I've been around since FIFG, EFF, EMFF. I can't even remember the first European funding, and I have the scars to prove it. I think Sebastian hit the nail on the head, really, in terms of the threats of subsidies in terms of overcapacity and overfishing. But at the same time, I think it's careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you really want to increase the biomass and reduce fishing effort, then just reduce or remove the fuel subsidy for fishermen generally and small-scale fishers in particular, and you would genuinely and literally destroy the fleet overnight. And that is particularly relevant at the moment with the very, very high prices of fuel. And it's really only the high prices of fish, which are not sustainable, that are keeping the fleet going. So you must be careful what you wish for and try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think also in terms of subsidies, from sort of practical experience, you've got sort of what I call application efficiency bias, in as much as large-scale fishing businesses, as opposed to small-scale fishers, and until small-scale fishers realise that their businesses, they're always going to struggle. But these organisations and companies and NGOs have, people who can produce very good applications, and they do tend to get the lion's share of what is available. One of the speakers mentioned local development situations, but again, I can speak from experience, half of that goes towards the administration, as usual, local authorities, which is less than helpful. I have to say that over the years, the application system for EU funds has increased and improved significantly. We, as Ewan said, not we anymore, God help us, you can now get 100% funding for many aspects. It used to be 25, 30, 50%. And also you had to put the money up front and then apply to get it back. And many small-scale fishers really just didn't have the resources to pay for that. And the whole system was very, very onerous. Examples in the UK, and there's not very many good examples of anything coming out of the UK at the moment, but we did, actually our government did have some very significant support, provide some very significant support through the COVID crisis. And the notable ones at the moment are the fishery science improvement projects, where fishermen, large and small, they don't have to make a great scientific claim for research that's needed. They just have to have an idea. And if it's taken up, then universities or other researchers are funded to undertake the science. And very much a focus on small-scale added value projects, even to the extent of producing ice machines, providing transport, so that fishermen, and this was especially so in relation to Brexit, where we lost so many of our European markets, that we could then sell or encourage the sale of fish more locally. They worked really well. What didn't work very well is that they also provided pots for pots. So they provided for lobster and crab, you could claim for new pots that were more sustainable, but the government forgot to take the old pots away. So they actually double capacity overnight. So it's not terribly efficient. I think we also got to move, certainly in the UK, towards subsidising the use of electric engines. To the extent, and I still don't quite know how this is going to work, the government have suggested that because we have such extensive wind farms off our coast, that they will be able to have plugs where boats can come alongside and plug in and recharge. I'm not quite sure how you do that with a bit of weather running, but there you are. And I think that finally, if you don't, notwithstanding what Sebastian said about overcapacity and overfishing, which I entirely agree with in many respects, if we don't really get a handle on the overfishing and the impact on stocks, then frankly, all these discussions are going to be a waste of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Now we have also Katia and Milena. Please, Katia, if you want to contribute.
Yeah. Of course, I am returning to the person of European Commission. I am looking the subsidies, all the subsidies, as Jerry said, we know all the different funds for many years. So I am wondering if we are looking them through a gender lens. I am question myself, I didn't hear at all the word woman from your side, all of you speakers. And my question is that we know that the EFFF has a little impact on gender equality. We know that it was almost zero. So we, as a European network of women in fisheries, we are waiting the midterm evaluation of EMFF, and we still wait, I think, because in EMFF, the European Commission, after a lot of lobby of women in fisheries, introduced the indicator gender. So we would like to know if one day, of course, I know that somebody told me in the past that we didn't do this midterm evaluation due to the Brexit, but now I am wondering if we will have something coming out, or how much money they are spent for women, to women, and with women. except the two studies that the European Commission paid, is the women role in Mediterranean and Black Sea, and the other is done by Farnet and one very small from the European Parliament. We don't know what's happened on. We know that some member states, they focus more on gender and others not. But how we can progress and how we can do more on this gender equality, because there are women also in fisheries, maybe 3.20, but there are 25% in aquaculture. So we need to know how much money are spent for women.
Thank you very much, Katia. Milena?
Yeah, listening to all these discussions about subsidies, I was struck by the fact that it seems that they are all directed to protect fish stocks, which is fine, perfectly all right. We all want healthy fish stocks. But I was wondering if you could imagine also some subsidies for things that are not measurable, things that also need to be protected, like things like identities, cultures, work for women, things that are not measurable. And this view that we have to be efficient maybe doesn't fit with small-scale fisheries. I mean, because this fact that their contribution is not so easily measurable. So if we can imagine some kind of subsidies that do not aim to be efficient, but allow for some waste, but also allow to protect more than just fishing stocks.
Thank you very much, Milena. I think your words are somehow related with some of the ideas that Mikkel shared with us. He emphasized, I fully agree with that. He emphasized the need for subsidies that help collective action, that help the communities to participate in the democratic governing process in the coastal areas. I think enhancing collective action, enhancing participation, enhancing trying to end with the situation that Paul Den Bol described in the history of the participation at the European level of the different fleets, whereas larger scale we're always there, and the small scale usually we are not there at all. Now perhaps it's a bit better, but it's not the optimal situation at all. So I think we need to progress, and this is something that is not only relevant at the level of European Union, but it's also very relevant at the level of member states. It's something that member states should contribute definitely to this, to a change in this situation. We have several words. Owen is wanted to.
Yes.
On the screen.
Different Owen. Yeah, I just wanted to come back quickly on the last two speakers there. In terms of gender and identity and culture, these are things that are very important to understand how we have supported through the funds. And over the years, their importance has grown. I mentioned at the start as well, we had less of a reporting burden, for example, back in the EFF and before that, as Jerry mentioned in the previous funds, we got less information on how the money was being used. But we do have increasing emphasis on learning from the member states what operations they support that are there to support gender balance, that are there to look at community support through community-led local development. And we have a dedicated support unit. It was FARNet under the EMFF period. Now it's FameNet. And they're in particular engaging with those local communities to see how to better support them, examples of good practices, helping family businesses, helping women in fishers, to preserve the culture and the identity. And there is definitely a strong weight that we associate with that. And as we move into the next period with the MFF, we will have even more information back from the member states on how they use that money to support those things. You mentioned an evaluation of the EMFF. that will be, it's an ex post, so after the fund has finished, operations can still be supported until the end of 23. So the end of 23, we will be making an evaluation of how the support has been used over the 7-year period. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Owen. Fully agree that FARNet has done a very interesting job. In some cases, there is some hindrance from the management of the member states that make things more difficult for small-scale fisheries to participate in these schemes, because the complexity of the bureaucracy involved in this funding scheme might be huge, and it's not always a burden from the Commission, but it's a burden from the member states or the regions in the member states. Some help in this field would be very interesting. A last word, a last comment. Very brief, please. We are on the time.
Yeah. Hello. Does that work? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I thought the presentations were really interesting. And just to have a quick question, one thing I noticed that wasn't mentioned was the relationship and the effect of indirect subsidies. We talked a lot about the direct subsidies and the MFF and MFAF and how it has progressively improved. But fundamentally, you have a lot of these indirect subsidies, which can be, for example, not implementing different areas of policy. It can be that with a fuel subsidy, for example, that it proportionally benefits one segment over another segment. And these indirect subsidies, effectively, they change the supply side market. They don't create a level playing field. They give a disproportionate advantage to certain actors. And I was just noting down some different areas of EU policy. If the lack of implementation for Article 17, for example, that represents an indirect subsidy to vessels which don't fish selectively. You have the landing obligation. The landing obligation is a perfect example of an indirect subsidy. You provide a quota top-up, and then no control, and therefore you're effectively incentivizing high grading, which again provides an additional subsidy to a trawl segment who might be fishing on the same stock as the small-scale fleet. Another clear indirect subsidy is the lack of implementation of engine power regulations, where you have a clear ceiling on what type of, how much fishing effort is allowed on a stock. And because this policy isn't implemented and isn't controlled, again, you're providing an indirect subsidy to the larger scale fleet. And all of these skew the economics of the fishery and effectively give a worse deal to sustainability. They give a worse deal to the small scale fleet. And I think the EU has made really good progress on direct subsidies, but until you get a grip on the indirect subsidies, then the small scale fleet won't benefit, and we'll continue to have this level of inequality within the segments. Thank you.
Very interesting question. I need to remember that some of these indirect subsidies are under the responsibility of member states. European Commission might help, but member states need to contribute to this to improve the situation. Owen, if you want to make a last word.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very good points, very valid points, and all of the things that you mentioned are provisions of the Common Fisheries Policy, which we'll address in the communication on the functioning of the CFP. And there, what we want to do, the main message from that report will be that we need to have better implementation of what we have in place. So you mentioned engine power, landing obligation, Article 17, all of these things. We need to look at how they're implemented and move towards better implementation. We fully agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the presenters, all the commentators in the room. I think really most of the issues that are relevant in this arena of the subsidies have been highlighted, and I want to be grateful with all of you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. It's been a great discussion. I'd just like to pick on a couple of issues that Sebastian raised in his presentation. The first concerns a graph you showed of the benefits of different sectors, the extraction of petrol and fossil fuels was right at the top, huge benefits, and you went down the list, it showed the different benefits. And increasingly, this kind of comparison between different sectors is going to play a big role in who gets access to the ocean space in the blue economy. What we also need, alongside that table, is to show what the externalities are of these different sectors. It's all very well showing the economic benefits, but if we don't know what the impact these activities are having on the environment, then we are potentially rewarding industries which are having a high impact on the environment with access. So the blue economy really just remains the brown economy. You also brought in this issue of the total factor productivity, which is totally new to me. And you showed that the large-scale fishing sector is not necessarily more productive than small-scale fisheries, which is something that we've advocated and held all along. But this tool looks like a really useful tool for really getting closer to what the benefits of the two different sectors are and how support might be channeled more selectively in a differentiated way to one segment more than the other in order to bolster this improvement in productivity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think we need to close the session. And Ratana, you want to say something?
We do need to close, unfortunately. And again, this is it's been great conversation. I think it's something that we will need to continue to talk about. There are so many questions being raised. There are so many issues that we still need to address. So I think we would come back to do it more in the plenary, the next plenary, especially at 2 p.m. to talk about Imagine Low Impact Fisheries. And I think that would be when we can talk about, is it really the case that small scale fisheries are sustainable, and how to think about how to, address some of these, channel some of these subsidies into helping and supporting small scale fisheries. And I would also recognize that, keep in mind that some of the metrics that we're using to make those estimates that we see, all those figures and graphs, we need to kind of be careful about where they come from to start with, and whether they're comprehensive enough, both in terms of benefits and values and contributions, and also in terms of impact. So thank you very much, all the speakers. Let's do another round of applause, and also the commentators. Thank you, Brian and Petra, for running this great show. So please enjoy the break and be back at the concurrent session would begin at 11:30 your time. And then we'll see you again after lunch at the next plenary. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Well done.